Hey, what's up you gamers, Bracky here. Now around 6 months ago, I wondered, would it be possible to defeat MHRise Sunbreak's final boss, Gaismagorm, using only low rank equipment? I assumed it would be, but whether I would actually be able to do it was another question entirely. Nonetheless, I decided to step forward into the unknown, and attempted to take down one of the biggest baddies MHRise Sunbreak has to offer, while only wearing some shitty low rank drip and what might as well have been my used dango stick from the canteen as a weapon. So was it possible? Let's find out. Now before we actually get into some gameplay footage and the hunt itself, I'd like to just quickly go over some rules and limitations that I've set for myself in the run. The first thing that became quite obvious to me was that there was no way for me to get past the fact that I would have to use a fully upgraded pedal ace. Since when the pedal aces upgrade during the story, they replace the former versions of themselves. Now because of this, I decided not to consider the pedal ace as a piece of equipment for the purposes of this video. Now, along these same lines, I also decided to allow myself the use of both high rank and master rank switch skills, since they don't really count as equipment either. Talismans, on the other hand, will be counted as equipment, and therefore cannot be used in the run. Following that, because upgrading armor technically doesn't require any master rank parts to complete, I decided that I would allow that too, although admittedly it doesn't make a whole world of difference, considering how we get one-shot by most of Gaismagorm's attacks anyways. This more or less just protects us from dying to smaller hits and chip damage, although combined with Feline Defender, we actually are able to occasionally eat some significant damage. Also, guns are banned. I feel like this might be self-explanatory, but something like LBG would be a little bit broken here, so we're crossing light bowgun and heavy bowgun off the list of potential weapon candidates. Oh yeah, layered armor is also allowed because drip. With those limitations in mind, we can now start to dive into some equipment. So in the preparation stage for the run, my first instinct is to lean towards the weapon I'm most comfortable with in Sunbreak, which happens to be Insect Glaive. Now to just sift through some of these low rank glaives and find out which one will be best for the... Okay, so we're crossing Insect Glaive off the list of potential weapons since we don't have access to any of the monster rank bugs, and the bugs we can use are still going to be bogged down by the abysmal Kinsect level and all the glaives that we actually have access to. So after some careful consideration, I decided to go with Switch Axe, despite being relatively unfamiliar with the weapon in Sunbreak. Now let's just have a quick look at some of the benefits of Switch Axe in this run, which should somewhat explain my choice of weapon here. Okay, so Switch Axe gives us access to an extremely powerful counter, which consistently gives us extra file damage by filling our amp gauge pretty much whenever we need it. Power File also gives us an extra 15% on our weapon's raw attack when we're in sword mode, which is pretty significant. Not to mention sharpness usage isn't too bad as long as we don't spam zero sum discharge. And if we can get Rapid Morph 3 in conjunction with the 2-stage Morph Slash switch skill, we gain access to DPS we wouldn't normally have access to in low rank by making morphing attacks occupy more of our combo time, letting us benefit more from the increased speed and 20% damage boost the Rapid Morph skill will be giving to our morphing slashes. Having taken all that into consideration and with our general playstyle in mind, the next thing I had to do was select a weapon. After some careful consideration, I decided to opt for the second tier Magnum Aloe Switch Axe, the Sinister Axe 2 as my weapon of choice. My reasoning behind going for this weapon is mostly due to the nice balance it has between solid sharpness and raw, as well as its access to power files and some extra blast element to assist with damage and power breaks, which are going to be pretty important for us in Gaismagorm's first phase. On top of this, the Magnum Aloe Switch Axe also gains the Attack Boost 3 ramp up, which is going to give us a nice much needed boost to our raw. Now next up is our armor. And considering that drip isn't an issue because we allowed layered armor, I'm free to put together the most messed up set of pieces imaginable without having to look like a total spud as a consequence. So my choice of armor ends up being a mix between Almadron, Tigrex, Death Stench, and Volvidon pieces, giving us a tidy mix of Rapid Morph 3 and Bludgeoner 3. This skill set leaves us with a nice, consistent 10% boost to our raw, given our long bar of green sharpness, as well as all the bonuses from Rapid Morph that are necessary to our playstyle. I considered reaching for attack boost instead of bludgeoner, but I found that it was much harder to get in lower rank, and it would need us to sacrifice a point in Rapid Morph to actually start outperforming bludgeoner in terms of base raw, which just isn't worth it. For my pets, I opted to bring 2 cats along, making sure both of them had access to the Summon Endemic Life skill, which would help me stay topped up on wire bugs throughout the fight, letting me play a little bit more aggressively by relying on my ability to counter incoming attacks. I also brought along a Palico with Rousing Roar to help give a little boost to my affinity throughout the hunt. For their equipment, I went for the low-rank Diablo's gear, which has decent resistances to fire and dragon, as well as some poison weapons to give us a little extra passive damage, assuming they can actually make it proc. Finally, before we get into the hunt, we had to go pick up some Dango. Now, while I could opt for a more defensive route, relying on Moxie and Defender to keep myself safe, this time around I decided to go all in on the offense, because I really need all the damage I can get. The Dango set I'm going with gives me Pyro level 4 for extra damage on my bombs, which will be somewhat integral to the fight, as well as Booster level 3 for some extra attack at the start of the hunt. And finally, Defender level 1, which can come in clutch and save me from some of Gaismagorm's more devastating attacks if I manage to actually get lucky. Anyways, with all that in place, I'm pretty much ready to get started in the hunt. So without further ado, let's see how my first few runs went and see what kind of problems we ended up running into. So yeah, what was quickly made apparent to me from this was the fact that the extra defense we got from upgrading our armor really doesn't mean a whole lot in front of most of Gaismagorm's attacks. The most troublesome of the bunch is that Clap of Doom, which starts up fairly quickly and mostly just requires you to be positioned well in advance to avoid it if you're in the middle of a combo. That being said, I don't really have the luxury of time, meaning I'm kind of just going wild and chasing good hit zones to deal the most damage possible without worrying too much about my positioning. That's all well and good as long as I'm able to nail my Silkbind counters, but one thing some of you might not know about this attack is that it actually hits twice. Luckily for me, however, it can still be fully countered so long as my timing is spot on. Also good news is the fact that the second hit is actually slightly weaker than the first when we counter it, because of our hyper armor, meaning that for the first couple of phases, even if I slightly mess up the timing, so long as I stay topped up on HP, I should be able to survive. When it hits phase 3, however, different story. Pretty much everything will kill us from full at that point, so we kinda just have to play well and hope we have some cards to spare. Anyways, back to the issue at hand. I already knew what to expect going into this, but it's gonna be a rough run. This first sort of play session you're seeing now went on for just under 2 hours, and I started to feel a little bit fatigued at that point. I'd gotten something of a feel for the matchup, and I just needed some kind of strategy to work with to be able to follow through and beat the hunt. Naturally, there was an element of just getting good to overcome, but I started to feel like I was getting closer to that point every single hunt. So after going outside and touching some grass while having a good hard think about some strategy, I came back fresh as a daisy and I was ready to do some damage. The core strategy of the run was pretty simple. In phase 1, our biggest source of damage are going to be the crystal breaks, which Gaismagorm will eventually suck up with his big vacuum attack. Given our low damage output, we're not likely to get a knockdown after one vacuum cycle, but there are still some things we can do to optimize ourselves as much as possible. Bombs play a big part in the run here because not only do they do really nice damage, irrespective of what hit zones they connect with, but because of this, they're great for snapping part breaks that wouldn't normally be worth going for with regular weapon attacks. So in the end, my strategy became to target Gaismagorm's front arms with my switch axe combos, and primarily aim for its second set of arms with bombs instead, because the hit zones aren't really that great there. That way I'm able to get the crystal drop part breaks on all 4 arms without really having to sacrifice any damage. The Dragonator artillery shot also gives us a whole bunch of free damage in phase 1, so we'll obviously be making use of that too. Overall, the phase 1 fight is pretty straightforward, considering a huge portion of our overall damage comes from either artillery or just Gaismagorm damaging itself. Not to mention the fact that in phase 1, the damage we take from most attacks isn't usually enough to kill us in one hit, so long as we stay topped up on HP. Phase 2 is where things start to get a little bit tricky. I opt to start by restocking on bombs and combines and then heading down into the phase 2 arena. My primary strategy for phase 2 is to force trips and capitalize on all the easy damage we can get. The part breaks for Gaismagorm's front legs reset for phase 2, so we can break them again for some easy trips and follow up with some big damage. Both the front arms break after a relatively predictable number of bombs, so if I can time the trips for when my amp gauge is full, I'll be maximizing my DPS output. While phase 2 is noticeably tougher than phase 1, and Gaismagorm gains access to a few new moves and a decent jump in damage output, we can actually still survive a few of its attacks and still counter the Clap of Doom without worrying too much about the potential chip damage from the second hit taking us out. That said, Phase 2 is still a bit of a jump in difficulty. The silver lining in Phase 2 ends up being the Ballista phases, of which we should be seeing quite a few. The Ballista phase is basically just free damage, although I'd be lying if I said I didn't die to those stupid Courier balls hitting me at least once in my practice runs. But here we can deal solid amounts of damage with minimal threat, and we also had the opportunity for a topple at the end, meaning even more free damage. Otherwise, the rest of our strategy is fairly straightforward. At the beginning of Phase 2, we grab the Lantern Bug and the Wire Bug to our right, and then grab the Fire Beetle at the back corner for some free damage, and just start going to town. Besides the bombs and artillery, there's really not much I can do except just go ham on this dude until he dies. During the time I spend in the melee phases, the most important thing is that I stay topped up on Wire Bugs for counters. Even though some attacks are dangerous to counter, it's still my #1 tool to defend myself when I find myself in a tight spot. And it's also my main tool for maintaining damage uptime, so I have to make sure it's being used frequently. Once I take all these things into account, all that's left is to brawl the monster until it reaches Phase 3. Phase 3 is the final showdown, where Gaismagorm really becomes a true threat. Pretty much everything this guy does basically becomes an OHKO, and the only thing we can really do is just play super defensively. On top of gaining a whole bunch of extra damage, Gaismagorm also gets a few extra attacks, including the one where he just walks around the area a few times and then goes boom, and also the one where he's all like, "Rocket to punch!" Honestly though, the primary threat in Phase 3 isn't either of those attacks, but the fact that even when I perform a partial counter on the Clap of Doom, I'll now be completely one-shot by the chip damage alone. So yeah, this phase is tough, like real tough. Thankfully, Gaismagorm is only at about 10 to 15% HP by this point, so we're almost there. We still get access to the Ballista in this phase, and bombs are still a somewhat safe way to deal damage, so we'll just have to use all the tools at our disposal and try our best not to get hit. Honestly, the bombs really do carry the run in this phase. They deal a similar amount of damage to our actual weapon in terms of DPS, so they become a super useful tool when we're unable to safely counter attacks. But yeah, there's really not too much to say about this phase, to be honest. It's mostly just me shitting bricks and trying to play as safely as humanly possible. Despite being the shortest phase in the hunt in terms of pure HP, I still spent around 12 minutes going back and forth, just trying to scrounge up whatever little damage I could. In the end, I died in this phase a lot throughout my runs against Gaismagorm, but finally, after about 3.5 hours of total attempts, we managed to connect with the finishing blow that brings our lower rank equipment run to an end, once and for all. Honestly, from the beginning of the run, I thought it might have been achievable, but I never really thought about just how simple it might actually be. I'm not a professional at this game by any stretch of the imagination, and in the past, being able to fight G-rank Elder Dragons and low-rank equipment basically just felt inconceivable. The thing that largely makes this run possible is obviously the ridiculous amount of artillery the game just gives you for free, which on its own is pretty much enough to kill the monster. Considering the amount of extra help I also had from switch skills, bombs, armor upgrades, and even the pedal ace, it's no wonder this hunt becomes achievable. But clearly, even without those extra improvements brought about by the Sunbreak expansion, killing Gaismagorm with only low rank gear is obviously quite achievable, and honestly turned out to be a really interesting challenge that I would even suggest other players try out if it looks interesting to you. In the end, the amount of time the final hunt took was just over 36 minutes in total, but if anyone else is keen to try out this challenge, I'd love to hear how long it took you in the comments below, and what equipment you decided to use. I'll also drop a link to my VODs channel down below where you can check out the full final hunt, just in case anyone wants to have a look at that. But yeah, just a quick reminder to you guys before the video ends. I do actually stream live most weekdays over on Twitch at twitch.tv/BrackyMH. So if you guys like what you see here, go drop me a follow over there as well, and come join in on the hunts in real time. Otherwise, a like and sub over here on YouTube would also be greatly appreciated if you enjoyed the video. But yeah, thanks for watching the video, guys. That's Bracky, signing out.